In this episode of ICS Connects, I'm talking to Andrea Tatum, and we talk about diversity and inclusion in the meetings industry and how the Black Lives Matter movement should inspire us to do better. So listen in and let's explore the future of exchange. Welcome back to ICS Connects. I'm here today with Andrea Tatum. She's a Senior Director for Corporate Equity and Engagement at Catalyst, an advocate for change, a diversity and inclusion leader, and a public speaker. I'm really happy to have you on this ICS Connects episode. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be with you.
I get your name, so I really apologize for that. We clarified that just a minute ago. Andrea, I was really looking forward to this conversation as it is such an important one to have. The Black Lives Matter movement and other similar initiatives have been around for years, trying to draw attention to racial inequality and injustice. But it took for us all to be locked up and more tragedies to happen, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, to actually have this conversation. And what this podcast or this episode is really about is we want to talk more than just police brutality. This is not about that only. It covers every aspect of life, including the global meetings industry. And I'm so grateful that today we can talk about that, about our roles as professionals in the meetings industry and simply as people to create a better, more inclusive environment. So thank you for being available to talk to us about that.
Thank you.
And maybe tell us a little bit about your background. What drives you? What made you this advocate for change and diversity and inclusion leader?
Yeah, so I have been doing a little bit of diversity and inclusion work, if you will, throughout my career. I actually started off working in nonprofit arts marketing. So I am a marketer by trade. And I always felt like when I went into certain places, I didn't feel like they were for me. The arts tend to be a very elitist community. So I didn't see myself in the marketing. I didn't see myself on the stages, and I didn't see myself even in the admin offices. So from a very early stage in my career, I began advocating, trying to find ways that we could make that change, because I felt it was really important that, we diversified those audiences, and that required being very intentional. And I was very fortunate that I had leaders who were open-minded to that. And I got to actually work on some really interesting initiatives at the theater that I first worked for, where we were even focused on making sure that our theater was more accessible and going through the ADA. And we were printing out Braille playbills for some of our shows and ensuring we had ASL or American Sign Language interpreters there. And that's really where I started in terms of my advocacy and really wanting to see that in the world of theater. And then fast forward several years, I ended up moving to the Bay Area, and I decided after working so many years in nonprofit, it was an opportunity to work in tech. And I took all of those years of experience as a marketer, as an event manager, as a project manager, and really pivoted into a full-time career actually doing events. And so I was overseeing a series of events for a tech company, both in the Bay Area, and then moved on to a company in Seattle. And when I got into those companies, it was really the same thing. I was saying, doesn't feel like I'm seeing the numbers in tech. Where are the people of color? Where are the Black people? Where are the women in tech? And so even though my job was to come in and help to sell the product and be a product marketer, I was traveling internationally and having these conversations and seeing in different places what diversity looked like, and coming back home and feeling very different. My feeling when I would be in Japan felt very different than when I came home. And so I really became an even further advocate, and then took a job full-time overseeing diversity and inclusion for a tech company, and really ensuring that everything from retention to hiring practices to creating inclusive workplace and inclusive workplaces was at the forefront of what we did. So I've had an interesting journey, and always with this lens of engaging diverse communities.
I'm actually interested. I want to pick up on that quickly because workplace. How do we actually, I mean, from every aspect, right? As leaders in workplaces, as managers, but also kind of as just members of the workplace, every single person that works for a company, how do we ensure that we create an inclusive environment?
Yeah, it really requires, like I just said, it requires being intentional. It really does require being mindful of the fact that you work in places that are diverse and that everyone is not the same. And even when you come across people, even within certain cultures and communities, they're not a monolith. And so taking the opportunity to get to know individuals is really important. I always say you have to just make this decision to try to get to know people, even at a personal level. It really just makes a difference when you're trying to work together. You build trust, you know, you're able to have different conversations. And so you want to really get to know someone, and you may realize, oh, this person is a mother, a daughter, a wife, a partner, a spouse, and oh, or this person is a person of faith. And I didn't realize, you know, perhaps that as a person of faith, on Fridays, they're going to go to prayer, or they need to take time out of their day a few times to go and do that. You may not realize that the person who you're working with may have mental health issues, and that they may need to take time away, and they may cope in certain ways. So really getting to know people, I think, is the first step to being able to be inclusive, because then you can authentically have conversations about who they are, what drives them, and what motivates them. And that's, it takes being vulnerable a little bit to be able to do that. And that's actually the opposite of what most people have really actually been taught going into work, which is just go to work, put your head down, do the job. But the reality is we can't really do that anymore. And when companies say, oh, we want people to bring their whole selves, their authentic selves to work, we're complicated beings. And, you know, you don't want people to have to cover who they are. So by allowing people to have space to be authentic, it just takes a weight off of people who may otherwise feel the need to cover, or to not, you know, perhaps say, oh, this is my partner or my spouse, if they're, you know, whatever that may be. So I think just creating space for inclusivity and honesty and authenticity are so important.
So in that sense, and you mentioned a lot of things, and I think it's so important that we understand that inclusivity as people, we're so complex, and there's so many things that impact us, like how we grew up, who, like if we grew up poor or rich, if we're well-educated, not well-educated, male, female, gay, straight, married, not married, all of those things impact us a lot. I quickly want to get to the point of race, kind of like at the workplace, how much race and not just race, also cultural background, right? So kind of like where you're from, like how much do you actually address this kind of like openly in a workplace? Like how much should this be a topic, or how much should we say, okay, we should just make sure we focus on other aspects of who we are as people, rather than racializing a conversation?
Yeah. So, you know, and it really does vary where you are in the world. But as a Black woman in the United States, it's very hard for me to not be that. When I walk into a room, I have natural hair, I have dark skin, I have, you know, when you physically see me, I cannot separate those parts of my identity. And so I think it's really important to be able to say, like, the conversation doesn't have to stay on race, but you can't ignore it. You know, you can't say, I don't see color, I don't, right? Because that is ignoring a part of who I am and the experiences that I've had. It also means that there have been systems in place that may have prohibited me from having some of the opportunities that other people may have. So you have to be willing to have those conversations about how there are systems of oppression that are in place, and what can you do, whether that means if you're a founder and you're building a new company, how do you ensure that the culture and the systems are set up to not create barriers for certain people, and I will say that for marginalized groups as a whole. So you really have to be conscious and aware of how you're approaching it, but it doesn't have to be at the forefront of every conversation. Correct. But it has to be the space to be able to have that and be willing to acknowledge when there are things that definitely, are impacted because of them. You cannot pretend that that does not happen.
And I think that's so true for everyone, because also you mentioned you get into a room and you're clearly a Black woman. I get into a room and I'm clearly a white man, and that comes with its own privileges and its own perceptions. And I think we need to be very aware of what that perception is that we have, and what that also creates for us. I'm very aware that I wish I probably could be more aware, but I'm aware that kind of as a white male, usually you're facing very little kind of like resistance to kind of like when you try to climb up the ladder, when you try to kind of like get into leadership roles, right? So, and I think it's also important for people like me to understand who we are and what that entails for other people around us.
Absolutely. I think just awareness, like that level of self-awareness is so important, and why it matters to have these conversations, because as people become more aware, they can also use their privilege for good. And that is just really the key, is when you can say, wow, I realize that I may have benefited from this, or that I can speak up, or that I'm not going to get the backlash. How do you use that privilege for good? And the more you become aware of those opportunities, it can just make such a big difference in the world.
I so agree. I think that's so important. Let me shift gears to slightly, well, it goes in the same vein, but you have this like experience in the arts, and also, of course, in the meetings industry or events industry. So the events industry, I always feel we're such multipliers, because what we do is like we disseminate knowledge, we bring people together. So what we do is actually amplified so much. In your time in the events industry, you mentioned you saw a lack of like really inclusive policies, or kind of an effort, a lack of effort into inclusivity. What do you think we need to do in the meetings and event space to become more inclusive, more diverse?
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
Conscious of it.
Yeah, I think, I have seen a lot of work, being done in this space, and we've hit some of the things that I call, like, at this point, baseline, right? Yeah. I think it's baseline to think about people's dietary needs. Do people need halal? Do they need kosher? Do they need vegetarian, vegan, right? Like, those are some of the most baseline ideas of inclusion. And many conferences and events now, you are seeing more mothers' rooms, spaces where moms can go and pump or breastfeed or whatever that may need. We're starting to see more things like prayer rooms on site at conferences. All of these things go to create a sense of inclusion. They're the things that if I was at home and had my creature comforts, that I wouldn't have to think about more. So as we create those inclusive environments inside of an event, it allows me to come in, learn, network, and do the things that I'm actually there to do. But I think that it requires kind of pushing past what are some of those most, basic things. It requires some design thinking. I talk a lot about kind of this yes and approach in events and in design thinking, which is like, okay, yes, we're going to we're going to, maybe have some networking events and things of this nature. And yes, we're going to, have our ID badges. Well, what are those opportunities that you can take? Now we're starting to see more people do pronoun stickers or pronoun buttons, which are great. But what is the level of depth that goes from what I kind of call performative allyship to more like making it a normative thing and it being more embedded? So thinking about even the system. So from the moment that someone registers for the conference, do they see those same things? Are you setting up, your registration to have more than just Miss and Mr.? Or just male and female? Are you being inclusive in the language that you're using? So you have to really think about it. And so often, right, like your registration systems are set up far in advance, and going in and really kind of breaking down some of those barriers, even from an entry point. Like if someone who's a part of the LGBTQ community and is maybe non-binary and identifies as they, them, the moment that they get on your website to register and they see that, what a difference does that make for them to feel like, I'm going to go to this space and feel welcome, and I no longer am concerned, right? And then the other thing that I like to think about, so you're pushing in terms of innovating throughout the conference. And then I also think about, the impact that the business can have. So one of the ways that I think about it is you're, especially large events, you're bringing hundreds of thousands of people possibly into a space, and you're really taking up a footprint somewhere. How do you give back to the local community that's in that space? How do you have a positive impact as well? And so one example, I was with a company and we did a huge conference in New Orleans. And New Orleans is a very diverse place, but it's very heavily African-American and Black people who may not have some of the same advantages as my peers who are living in Washington, D.C. or living in Seattle or other tech hubs, to hearing about some of the technology and advances in career opportunities. So we did our big annual customer conference where we brought 20,000 people in, but we also looked outside and brought in students and sponsored a day, and it added nothing extra really to the event cost, but we were able to expose students to this, from historically Black colleges and universities and other local universities to professionals and give them an opportunity to see what they could be. And that is giving back. And I think that when conferences and the events industry can also think about how do you give back and how do you make an impact, that could really be a huge way to do that.
That's so important. I feel it's so important to keep that in mind always. And I always like very much also when it can give back, and you mentioned that, within your space. Of course, you can go out and do community work, but if you can share something from your own expertise, that's so important, right? So, and think in your own space first. About that, I feel very often when we talk about inclusion, we focus a lot on the delegate side and say, how can we diversify the delegates we have, the people that are actually attending. But we also need to diversify the stage, right? So it's important to learn from each other and to kind of like make sure. And I feel that's still a difficulty for many. I still feel there is a real lack of diversity on stage. It's still very often dominated by white male. And we're sometimes seeing quotas. Do you have any kind of like experience with that, how that can be achieved better, how it can create much more diverse stages as well?
Yeah, I definitely recommend broadening your networks. It really, again, this work is intentional work. It doesn't just happen to get more diverse. If you're not consistently going out and networking, your industry, the types of speakers that you're going to be looking for. I think also, changing what your expectation is, right? Like if you have one vision for who, is the speaker, and it's always going to be the CEO of such and such company, well, you are really limiting who could be it. And I think the idea of expert has to be expanded, because there are many women and people of color and people with, who are neurodiverse and or have disabilities, who are amazing, and they just may not be the CEO. They may not be the person who is at the forefront of a company. So it really means digging a little bit deeper, looking for thought leaders who are out there in spaces, looking for speakers bureaus. Like I work with some speakers bureaus who specifically work with women of color to bring them into spaces. And women of color can talk about more than just diversity and inclusion. You want women of color to talk about science and STEM and all of these other things and data, and there are so many, but when your network is limited to who you kind of know or maybe went to college with, or then it's going to continue to be limited. So you really have to be willing to say, what are the conversations that we want to have, and who are the voices that we want to ensure are represented, and go and look for them. Ask questions, network, ask, say like, who else knows someone, because it requires that level of deep digging. And I love it when people come to me and say, hey, Andrea, I'm doing this thing, and I know that you know people, and if you don't know someone, can you connect me to someone? Absolutely, I can do that. And that means that you're thinking a little bit harder about it than just kind of resting on your laurels and going, this guy, we saw him speak at this thing. There are so many people who are ready to build their like portfolio of speaking and just don't get the same access.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the big problems here is kind of like one thing we talked before, like you have to be very aware of your own self. And when you're aware of your own self, you're sometimes getting aware of your own bubbles that you're within. So whenever I hear somebody say, oh, it's not about gender or race or background, it's about best person for the job, I'm like, well, it might be best person that you know. Yes. It's not necessarily the best person that's out there. So you need to kind of go beyond your own bubble and your own network, as you said. And I think that's so important because passing the mic, I feel, sharing the stage is integral to real change.
Yeah. And I've really loved seeing some people, especially white men in different spaces saying, asking the question, if you're a speaker, saying like, how diverse is your roster of speakers? And if it's just white, then I will suggest someone else, because I know other people, women or otherwise, who may be really good. So when that's using your privilege again. So when you are being asked to speak, and if you're constantly kind of getting that access, being able to say like, hey, actually I can recommend other people as well. That's really helpful.
Yep. And it might be harder, but it's also more fulfilling, because you might learn something along the way as well, because you listen to a different viewpoint, and that's important. So there's so many things going on right now, not just in the US, in the world. And I've read some of your articles, and I have to say they're inspiring and they're really thought-provoking. What is your big hope that comes out of the current movement in general? Like we talk about the meetings industry, but this is a much bigger kind of like movement. What's your hope that where we're going to go with this?
My hope is that it doesn't just kind of be seen as a moment, and that it really and truly is seen as a movement, that we are ready to see major changes, that people acknowledge the harm that has been done. And I think that's really this first step in being able to make really far out there change. I think we've been making these very incremental, small changes. Someone asked me, how do you feel about this versus the civil rights movement? I said, it hasn't ended. There are people who have been advocating and fighting, and that fighting just hasn't stopped. And the conversation just can't continue to peak and then go down and peak and then go down. It has to be a consistent drumbeat of people from all communities working together to advocate for these changes that just really have to happen across the board. And so my hope is that the conversation does not die down, and that the enthusiasm that we started seeing 2 months ago doesn't go away as, you know, a trendy hashtag that happened, because these are real lives. These are real people who are dying. These are real people who are, you know, put it in a corporate sense, who are not getting access, or who are not getting able to progress in their jobs, which means they may be continuing to live below poverty levels. And it's all just very cyclical. And so if people just rest and say, okay, well, we talked about it. You know, I think that a lot of people believe we're living in a post-racial society, and it's just, you know, it's not the truth. You know, yes, we had a Black president, but that did not solve all our problems.
Obviously not, yeah.
Yeah, and I think those are the kinds of attitudes that are problematic and are hindrances when you go, well, you have a Barack Obama and you have an Oprah, so what are you complaining about? Like, those are two people who have been incredibly successful, but like, let's really talk about the deeper issues that are at hand. And we want to see reform, and we want to see change, and we want to be able to have safety when we walk into the streets. I want to have safety when I walk into my job. I just want to be able to function without fear. And I hope that we get to a point that we can all live that way.
I think it's such an important point, and I'm so happy you shared this with us. And I think it's so important that we also realize that this comes really home for us, and we have the power to make real change. And we talked today about how you can do that in the workplace. We talked about how you can do that for meetings, areas that we can influence today, tomorrow, right away. We can change the way we do things immediately and have real impact and can be really part of the change. But beyond that, we're also people that don't just live through a job or through our industry. We also kind of like are out there, and we might want to make other changes by just our behavior, by how we treat others and how we deal with others. What are some of the tips that you could give somebody like me or anybody listening out there to be a meaningful ally to the Black community?
I always like to tell people that, you know, allyship is earned first and foremost. You do not get to just claim that you are an ally, and that allyship is a verb, that it requires work. You have to consciously kind of make the decision that you're going to do it. And that starts at the baseline of educating yourself. Don't make assumptions. Read. There are so many great books, and there are so many great people to follow, you know, expand your network, right? Consume new information, educate yourself, realize there are a wide variety of voices that you can hear from. And then, you know, kind of that second phase is just recognizing your privilege, recognizing your prejudices, recognizing your own biases. And that part of the journey in allyship is hard, because we all have prejudices. We all have bias. But what are you willing to do, and can you acknowledge it? And that self-awareness part is often really difficult. But if you don't do it, then how are you going to help? And then, like, once you really kind of do that work, do those kind of initial steps, then you can start to speak up. Then you feel comfortable. Then you feel empowered to speak up and say what you need to say and advocate on behalf of other people. And be okay with the fact that you may not get it right every single time. It is complex, it is messy, and the goal is to try. It is to not just sit in fear of accidentally saying the wrong thing. Think of it, if someone corrects you, as them actually being your friend. And like, if you had toilet paper on the back of your shoe and someone told you, that person isn't trying to do you harm. They are actually taking care of you by correcting you. And so it's don't be offended, don't be hurt, don't be dismissive. If someone does correct you, go back and kind of start and think about that and just acknowledge it. Say, you know what? I was wrong. I'm going to do better in the future, and then do better. And then you just keep pushing forward. And I think that's a cycle, because every time there's something out there, you know, there's always more to learn about. There's always more to advocate for. And so you have to continue, you have to be willing to continuously be in this virtuous cycle of allyship, and be willing to do the work, and willing to advocate for people, and be willing to speak up on others' behalves, and be okay with when you get it wrong and trying to do better again.
That is such a wonderful kind of sentiment and note to leave it on. Andrea, this was so fantastic. I really think it was inspiring. For me personally, it's one of those things, you watch the news, you feel so helpless on the sidelines. I'm sitting in Singapore right now. We don't have protests here. You sometimes feel like I can do nothing, right? But you gave us so many tips and pointers of what we can do in our own environment to really be part of the change. And I think that's so important. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being part of this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.